Alright, let's look at creating a custom web component. In the components folder, we're going to create a folder, and the folder's name is going to be the same as the element name that we want to create. So in this case, it'll be, let's say, hello-world. Okay, and so inside this folder, we're going to need two files, hello-world.js file, which is going to be our JavaScript side of the component, and then hello-world.html. We have a clear separation between the JavaScript and the HTML. Not all components need to have HTML, but we prefer to keep the two separate if you do. So first things first, let's go and create the class that the component needs. So it needs to have the same name as the element that we're going to use, so there's some form of a matching between the names. So we will just call this export class hello world, and this needs to extend an HTML element. Now that I have that, I can go and say custom elements.define, and the element name that I want to define is hello-world, and then the class that I want to use is the hello world class. Now, in essence, I'm pretty much there with the setup, but there are some lifecycle events that we want to hook up early on, and we also want to make sure that we can load the HTML. So there is a connected callback in the web component standard for lifecycle events. So when the component is added to the DOM, this event will fire. And then there's also a disconnected callback that will fire when the element is removed from the DOM. And generally speaking, we want to add both, but because we're going to work with asynchronous functions, we're just going to make both of these functions async. You can almost just do it by default. It won't hinder you in any way. Now I want to load the HTML, but because I use the convention where the JavaScript name and the HTML name is the same, and because the HTML file is in the same folder as the JavaScript file, I can use that convention to load the right HTML file quite easily. So we're going to say that this .inner HTML is equal to, and then we want to await the fetch API call, and then the URL that I want to fetch is a little bit on the tricky side, but not really. So we'll say import.method.url, which is the URL of the JavaScript file. Replace for me the .js extension with .html, so that'll be give me the HTML file back, and then when that promise returns, take the result and convert the result to text for me. So to understand how this works, you're going to need to understand promises, async, await, and the fetch API. So that might be something you want to go and have a look at. Once this is actually done, just from a convention perspective, just because I've loaded the HTML and it's part of the component now, what I want to do is give the component one frame time just to sort of load the stuff and render it and make sure that it's ready. So here we're going to add a request animation frame to say I want to do any further processing on the component over here. So if I want to fetch an element, maybe add some events, this will be a good place to do so. So now that I've actually added this, what do I have? I have a custom element that's called hello world. It has a class that when it is connected will go and fetch the HTML file and take the content of that HTML file and stick it as the inner HTML of this current component. So if I now go to welcome and I go and say, okay, well, hello-world, my expectation is that it will work, but in this case it's not actually going to do anything, and the reason for that is that we haven't loaded that specific JavaScript file. So in my view model, I can just go here and say import for me the components hello world.js, and now because that JavaScript file is loaded, it's going to register my custom element, which in turn will use this class to drive the component logic. Now we didn't actually add any UI to this thing in our HTML yet, so typically you would add your styles in here. We're gonna add a h2 that just says hello world, and in here I want to do my styling for the hello world component. So since I don't have any Shutter DOM attached to it at this point of time, I'm just going to say hello dash world h2, make the color for me a nice blue color, and then when I go to my web page, there's my hello world component. So just to prove you that this is actually the right thing, I'm just going to change the color here, go back, refresh, there you go, hello world. So just a quick recap: create the folder with the same name as the custom element that you want to create. Within that folder, create a JavaScript file with the same name and an HTML file with the same name. In your HTML file, have your styling with your actual component so that you don't have any render issues or artifacts on the load. And then to define a custom element, you need to use the custom elements.define function that comes natively with the browser. Provide it with a custom element name that you want to have, and then the class that you want to use. In this case, we use the hello world class that extends the HTML element. If you forget this, things won't work. It'll actually kick out an error. Then by default, we just add the two lifecycle events, connected callback and disconnected callback. In this case, we're not really freeing up any memory, but anytime you attach events and stuff, you're going to need to free it. So it's just good to get in the habit to create this off the bat. Then use a convention to say get the input meta URL, which is going to give us the URL for this JavaScript file. Replace the .js extension with the .html extension, which will then allow me to fetch this thing. When the fetch API comes back with the result, we want to get the text value of that, so it's going to give me the HTML content as text, and we set that to this component's inner HTML, which will essentially hydrate it with the HTML that we need. And then we have a request animation frame that within this we'll start doing all of our instantiation and manipulation of the DOM further. Easy enough.